Good day, this is Jim Pytel from Columbia Gorge Community College. This is Digital Electronics 1. This lecture is entitled The Not Logic Function. If you even have the slightest clue why I've got a picture of anthrax here discussing the not logic function, award yourself 1 cool point. Okay, so we've already been introduced to the not logic function in its most basic form. We're going to go into it a little bit more in depth. First off, the schematic. The schematic symbol for a not logic function was the triangle with a bubble. It's only partially true because all NOT gates have a power supply and a ground necessary for their function. I'm going to call that VCC. It's the supply voltage. They're always on every single logic gate. That's why they're removed. No sense in complicating the diagram. You've got an input, which I'm going to call A, and an output, which I'm going to call X. Okay, our truth table, A, X. When A is a 0, X is the opposite. It's a 1. When A is a 1, it's the opposite. X is a 0. Okay, it inverts it. That's as far as we've taken it thus far. Let's go ahead and go into a deeper understanding of the NOT gate. First off here, timing diagrams. Let's go ahead and try some timing diagrams. If this top timing diagram represents A, the input A, and it is constantly a 0, what will the timing diagram for X look like? Well, if A is a 0, look at the truth table, X is a 1. Just as we'd expect, our timing diagram for X should indicate a constant high. Let's do the opposite. What if A was a 0? Oh, excuse me, that's what we just did. What if A was a 1? What would our truth table for X look like? Opposite of 1 is a 0. It would be a 0. Okay, do you see what I'm doing here? Is we've taken our truth table and put it in timing diagram format. And what's really cool about the NOT gate, just like gravity, it goes to work every single day. As long as it's on, it's inverting the input. What does this timing diagram look like? If this is A, what's the output X look like? So, start at the beginning. A is a 0 right here. X is the opposite. Refer to your truth table. If A is a 0, X is a 1. So from here to here, it's a 1. Now get to this point. A changes to a 1. Look at your truth table. A is a 1, X is a 0, and so on and so forth. What does X look like? It looks like the mirror image of A, because it is the inversion of A. Okay, that's one way to think of it. It's the mirror image. It's opposite land. Let's go a little bit further here. Try a pulsed waveform with a little bit of a duty cycle. Let's say that's A. What's the output X look like? Well, it's the exact opposite, obviously. Do it in blue this time. So we went from something having a what duty cycle? Looks like this one was off for 3 blocks, on for 6 blocks. I bet it's got a 66% duty cycle. What we did, we just converted that into something that has a 33% duty cycle. Okay? So that's potentially one function of a NOT gate, an inverter. So here up top, I have an image taken from a data sheet for the 7404. 7404 is what's known as a hex inverter. Why is it called a hex inverter? Because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. Hex. 6 inverters. Between 1 and 2, there's an inverter. Between 3 and 4, there's an inverter. 5 and 6, there's an inverter. 9 and 8, an inverter. 11 and 10, an inverter. 13 and 12, an inverter. Some data sheets actually will have the gates drawn internally to them. I purposely picked this picture because it did not have the gates on them. Okay, where is inverter 1? Right there. Okay, which pins does inverter 5 use as its input? It uses pin 11 as its input. Which pin does inverter 3 use as its output? It uses pin 6 as its output. What's pin 14 and 7 doing? Well, remember what I said? I'm only partially drawing the schematic when I do that. There's a VCC connection and a ground connection for every single one. You have to have pin 14 connected to the supply voltage, and you have to have pin 7 grounded, okay, for the whole chip to function. It doesn't work if otherwise. I guarantee, first lab, someone's going to make this mistake. It happens every year. Additionally, when you see something that looks like a pulsed waveform and a schematic being applied to a pin, it means exactly that. It's a pulsed waveform being applied to that. This is not a pulse. It is constant, rock solid, 5 volts DC. This is constant ground. So that's the second most common error. First one is don't power it up. Second one, powering it up with a pulsed waveform. So a brief note here too about when you see inversion inside text or inside code, you're going to see this not operator. The not operator, as I mentioned previously, x equals not a, or a bang, or a hash. In Vhdl, the code is x. The variable x is assigned not a, semicolon. Okay. One thing too to notice here, this case Vhdl, it's case insensitive, but most variables are typically expressed as lowercase. Constants are expressed as uppercase. So x is also lowercase. I know you can't really tell that, but it is. Okay. So that's Vhdl code for a NOT gate, which when you enter it in Vhdl and provide that code to a programmable logic device, it will create a NOT gate for you. Okay? So one thing to imagine, like I said earlier, you don't need to know how these things work. One thing to imagine is there's an input here, and there's somebody in here that's looking at that input, and tossing an output over the wall. It's not really like that, but it helps me to describe what's going on here. If you could imagine that there is no way that input could ever get to the output. It's a high impedance, high resistance. There's no possible way current can get from one side of a device to another. And it's helpful to think of it that way, just as looking at the inputs, assigning an output based upon those inputs. This becomes important a little bit later, because we're going to talk about sourcing and sinking relationships. Just think about the input now. How am I going to provide an input to this thing? How am I going to provide a logical 0? Ground it. There's my 0. What is my output? Plus 5 volts if I'm using a TTL logic. Okay? How am I going to ground it? Stick a wire to ground. How am I going to see what the high output is? Well, it's going to be my DMM. I just take it with reference to ground. It's 5 volts in the output. How am I going to provide a high input? Stick it to plus 5 volts. What's my output? It will be 0 volts with reference to ground. I put my DMM on the output. That simple trick here of kind of switching back and forth between plus 5 volts, and I know I just did it, and ground, is not a recommended practice. and there's a reason why. I know this is a fixed function integrated circuit. I know pin 1 will always be an input, okay? And I know pin 2 is always going to be an output. What if that was a programmable logic device where the pin can be an input one day or an output the next day, or an input and an output, okay? So that would be a problem, okay? If I said on one day, hey, that pin is an input, I'm going to switch it to ground, and then accidentally download the wrong code where pin 1 is now an output providing plus 5 volts. Plus 5 volts on this end of a low resistance wire, ground on this end of a low resistance wire. What is the current? Probably enough to cause some problems right there. 5 volts on one end, 0 volts on the other. Just another example of that. Let's say it was an input at one point, and I hook that thing directly to 5 volts, and I mistakenly download the wrong program, and it's now an output, and it's outputting a 0 volts, and I'm tied directly to 5, exact same problem. So how are we going to prevent that? Okay, so it means, and it is commonly accepted, it's good to do this. It's a recommended procedure to do this, to short circuit protect your inputs and outputs. And the reason why is because it's common practice for a programmable logic device. Your ins are not always your ins, your input pins. Those pins are not always ins, they're not always outs. It depends upon how your program defines them. Okay, so let me go ahead and clean this up and show you how a recommended procedures. Okay, so this thing right here may not look like the most sophisticated means here. It's really kind of the same thing with the addition of this. It's a resistor in there. Okay, so you might be thinking, hey, wait a second. Jim earlier in the logic levels class, logic levels lecture, told me that I want a clear 0 or a clear 5 or clear 1 applied to my input. Won't a resistor in the way cause some voltage drop across the resistor and thereby drop the amount of voltage applied to the input of the gate? Well, the answer is nope. It's high impedance. Okay, there is no way current can get through that device. So basically, there's no current that flows. Okay, when, if you could just imagine, a resistor hanging out in space, it's hooked to nothing at this end. That's a high impedance device. Put 0 volts at that end. What's the voltage at that end? 0 volts. Okay, no current is flowing. Same thing happens when I've got the switch flipped the other way. 5 volts at one end, plus 5 volts right here. It's hanging out in space. There's no way current can flow. If there is no current flowing, the whole thing is charged up to 5 volts. What's the voltage at this end? 5 volts. Okay, it's a means of short circuit protection. The reason why is, what happens now if I accidentally load the wrong program where my previous in is now an out, and I'm accidentally supplying a 0 volt signal here? That same problem that we had earlier where 0 volts and 5 volts directly across a low resistance wire doesn't exist because the voltage drop now, plus to minus, occurs across the resistor. All the voltage drop does. Okay, same thing if I switch the switch over here, I accidentally provided a 5 volt output signal, the voltage drop occurs across the resistor. Okay, so it's a means of short circuit protection. Okay, so that is a single pole double throw switch. This is how the FPGA that I use a lot, either the Nexus 2 or the Nexus 3, that's how the slide switches work on it. It is short circuit protected on its inputs. What if I only had a single pole, single throw switch? Let me redraw this. And I had a setup very similar to this, but I put a switch here, a single pole, single throw switch. This is perhaps the dual inline package switch I was referring to earlier. What, with the switch open, remember this is a high impedance device, what does the input of this particular inverter see? And again, it is a high impedance device. There is no way that current can get from one end to the other. Okay, so again, considering that that gate is a high impedance device, the whole resistor is at 5 volts. So that's when it's open, it's providing a 1. Let's go ahead and close the switch. Okay, switch is now closed. There is a voltage drop across the resistor and current will flow. Conventional current will flow. All voltage drop appears across the resistor. What is the input now? Well, when 5 volts is dropped across a resistor, and it's a 5 volt supply, what's left? 0 volts. Okay, so this is a common relationship that we're going to be using a lot for our single pole, single throw, dual inline package switches. Okay, so let's go ahead and put our actual gate back in here. Actually, let's just go ahead and erase the whole circuit. My question to you is, I take my 7404, I provide plus 5 volts to pin 14, I provide ground to pin 7, and I provide no input to pin 1. What is the output of pin 2? So pin 1, that's my input, that's my output for inverter 1. Now, it's a trick question. The answer is you don't know until you go to lab. Okay, will an open be read as a 0 or 1? Let's say the output for an unconnected input was a 1. What is it reading as the open? The answer is 0, because we're now using our truth table here. If it's reading an output 1, obviously, if it's supplying an output 1, obviously it's reading a 0. And, opposite land, if we in fact observed a 0 with an open input, what is it assuming the open input is? We're reading our truth table backwards here. This is for you in lab, you'll do this. I've taken one image from one of the data sheets for the 7404. Let's go ahead, if you've got access to a computer, go ahead and pause the tape and see if you can find a data sheet. Okay, like I said, the internet is a tremendous resource. We're going to use it a lot. And one of my favorite spots to get a data sheet for the 7404 is alldatasheets.com. So let me go ahead and pull that up. And I've got alldatasheets.com right here. You get these annoying ads at the top, but I've already previously searched for the 7404. And there it is. It's giving me the function table. And in the lower left-hand corner, what does that box with a flag on it look like? Well, that's the IEEE ANSI rectangular boxes. It's got an input 1A on the left, which is pin 1, and output 1Y, 2 on the left. There's the function table right immediately above it. That is why those rectangular box symbols are used. They're nice and handy to see how compactly lay them out. Upper right hand corner here, we've got another one with a pinout packages, basically the exact same one that I had previously. And now let's go ahead and go down a little bit. It's showing the actual gates in there in the lower left. Oh my gosh, that's what's inside it. Okay, don't worry about it for this class. You're going to learn it later. There's a bunch of information on these data sheets. You've got your minimums and maximums. I'm just going to stop this thing and get to the spot I want. Okay, I'm right where I want. I'm on page 3, the very bottom of page 3. This is, by the way, the TI 7404 from the, from alldatasheets.com. The lower right-hand corner here. Switching characteristics. Uh-oh, we're not ideal. Look at that parameter. TPLH. Time for the pulse transition from low to high. If I look on the right-hand side there, it says a typical delay of 12 nanoseconds, up to a maximum of 22 nanoseconds. Look at that next parameter, TPHL. Typical delays of 8 nanoseconds, all the way up to 15 nanoseconds. So what this is implying here, my timing diagram, my perfect, beautiful timing diagram, is not ideal anymore. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to some of our timing diagrams. What I'm saying, there's a real delay for these. If there's a slight delay in these things, my real waveform is actually going to look something like that. I'm trying to do it really small. There's a slight delay there. And ideally, I should be transitioning from a low to a high there, but there's a slight delay. It's not big, don't worry, it's 12 nanoseconds there for that one. But look at this. Here's a brief moment in time where both the input and the output are simultaneously taking the value of 1. Uh-oh, there's a problem there. Because I thought an inverter always take the opposite. For the most part, yes, it does. Be aware that there are brief moments in time where that happens, where they're simultaneously. Same thing here. That brief moment in time, because of the delay, they're simultaneously 0 on the timing diagram. This is what's known as a glitch. We try to avoid glitches for the most part. Okay, there are ways to get around them too. Okay, sometimes they're inevitable. What we'll try to do is make them as fast as possible. We get it over with as quickly as possible. That brief erroneous state. Talked a lot about the inverter, how it functions, what it does. We looked at the data sheet. One thing too is, what is it used for? This sounds kind of dumb, the whole take a signal, invert it. Well, think about this. There's some math that we're going to be doing later. I made previous mention to an adder can be used as a subtractor. Well, that's the first step. It's forming what's called the 2's complement of a number. The first step in forming the 2's complement of a number is take the inversion of a number. So if I've got like a bunch, if I've got an 8-bit number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines coming in, and I want to form the inversion of that for the first step of the 2's complement, all I do is I just take 8 inverters, and there's the first step of forming the 2's complement. Okay, it's if I wanted to form the 2's complement, don't worry about it now, but you'll worry about it next week. Additionally, there is sourcing and syncing. I can use this NOT gate. I know we're just using a single gate now. Let's just say I've got this incredibly complicated logic circuit here, and I've got one output there, and I want it to be opposite of what it is. Just put a single NOT gate there. Why would I want to do something like that? Well, it's very critical to what we're about to discuss next. Sourcing versus syncing, often known as high side or low side switching. Okay, so one of the common things that we're going to be doing in our labs is indicating the presence of a 1 or a 0 with this device called an LED, light emitting diode. You're going to go into these things in great detail in your other electronics classes. But for our intents and purposes, just think of them as electronic check valves. If you guys remember from hydraulics, a check valve is something that allows fluid flow in one direction but blocks it in the other. Okay, it's got the ball in the seat. When flow tries to go this way, it forces the ball to the seat and it's not going to go. Whereas if flow goes from one direction, it forces the ball off the seat and it flows. Same thing electrically. If I put a plus 5 volts, i.e. a supply on one end, and have lower voltage at this end, current will flow. Think of the arrow. Conventional current will flow. And because this got a little lightning bolt symbol, it's providing light when it does it. But if I provide plus 5 volts at that end and 0 volts at that end, it can't flow because there's a wall in the way. Flow in one direction, no flow in the other. Conventional current flow. How do we do this with our NOT logic function, and why is it used in what's called a sourcing and syncing arrangement? Okay, so there are 2 ways to light up an LED. And my question is, use what lights up an LED, a 1 or a 0? The answer is it depends on which of the 2 methods you use. Okay, so let me go ahead and draw both of them. You can compare and contrast. So I've drawn 2 arrangements of logic gate, an LED, and a current limiting resistor. Logic gate, LED, current limiting resistor. It doesn't always have to be a NOT gate. I'm just trying to illustrate the concept of sourcing and syncing right now using a NOT gate. Look at the one on the left. When input A is 0, what is output X? It's a 1. There is plus 5 volts on this side. What's this right here? That's ground. What is the resistor for? It's just a current limiting resistor, so the LED doesn't burn out. There is a voltage drop across the LED. Current flows. The gate is sourcing. It's providing that electrical energy. If you could think about, it's providing that 1. It's providing that plus 5 volts to get the current to flow. Okay, that's sourcing. So in a sourcing arrangement, we're using a NOT gate. What logic level on A lights the LED? The answer is 0. Okay, what logical level on X lights the LED in a sourcing arrangement? 1. Okay, opposite. What happens now? A is a 1. X output is a 0. 0 volts on this side, 0 volts on that side. Is there any potential difference? No. there's no lighting of the LED. You can, this is a sourcing arrangement. I have not changed it, changed this arrangement. But the LED does not light when A is a 1. It does light when X is a 0. So it depends on which side of the NOT gate you're looking at lights it up. Okay, so that's a sourcing arrangement. You can always put that LED in backwards too. There's 100 ways to do this thing wrong. Okay, by the way, what is an LED? How do you tell what's the anode and the cathode? The longer one is the anode. That's the positive end. Okay, that's the indoor. The negative one, that's the cathode. And I love my coworker's memory trick. He hates cats, so cats are negative. Anode and cathode. Don't hook it on upside down. Don't be the jerk too that does this. Clips that lead shorter so your lab partner messes it up. So that was our sourcing relationships. Syncing. I've got A and I've got X. Let's say A is a 0. X is the inversion of A. It's a 1 plus 5 volts. Plus 5 volts on this side of the LED, plus 5 volts on that side of the LED. Is there a potential difference? The answer is no. It doesn't light up. So when A is a 0, it does not light up in a syncing relationship. X is a 1, it does not light up in a syncing relationship. Whereas, if A was a 1, the inversion of A, X is a 0. 5 volts there, 0 volts there, potential difference. The LED lights up in a syncing relationship. A, 1 lights up. X, 0 lights up. Okay, so it depends on how you have these things arranged, and that is the use of a NOT gate often. Sometimes you want it to light on a 1, sometimes you want it to light on a 0. Okay, it depends on how you want to. It doesn't always have to be a NOT gate too. This could be the output of some combination of gates. Could be an AND gate in there with A's and B inputs. Okay, you can have a syncing relationship or a sourcing relationship for the output of that. One quick mnemonic device I think to use to sourcing and syncing. Think of sourcing. It's providing electrical energy. Okay, there's already a path to ground in a sourcing. The path to ground is right here. This end of it has to provide the energy. It's sourcing the energy. Whereas syncing, that energy is here. It's already there. It's already constantly being supplied. All it's got to do is just get a path to ground. So syncing, again, like my coworker likes to describe, you got a sink full of water. You got a sink full of voltage, and it's just sitting there because you got the stopper in. All you got to do, pull the plug on that stopper. Current will flow, i.e. the light will light up. Okay, sourcing versus syncing. Be expected to be confused about this because you might have an entirely functional logic circuit but getting totally opposite values. Chances are you've done the logic circuit correctly, you're just incorrectly interpreting sourcing or syncing results. Last but not least, think about input of a NOT. Digital data. Let's call that A. Whoops. What's the output? Well, the output is X, which happens to be not A. What if I fed that one's output to another NOT gate's input? What's that? To another NOT gate's input, to another NOT gate's input, to another NOT gate's input, on and on and on and on. We'll go into this. If this, let's call this one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The input for 1 is A. Its output is not A. The input for 2 is not A. The negation of not A is not A, which is A. So it seems unnecessarily complicated right now. Why would I ever do something like this? Why would I ever invert it and invert it again? Go back to those glitches I referred to earlier. Yeah, there's sometimes you want to avoid those things. Maybe you want to purposely delay a signal. That's what's known as a buffer. Additionally, think about this. What if I had like 100 of these things and they all had a 10 nanosecond delay? What if I fed this one's input back to its output and provided it was an odd number of these things? You would get something pretty cool that oscillated back and forth. An oscillator changes. It's an astable. Astable means it's not stable. It's a clock signal. Don't worry so much about this right now, but think about that. Now we're going to be dealing with not just single gates. We're going to be dealing with the outputs of some gates being the inputs for others. I think it's a pretty neat illustration of some of the Boolean laws, which we'll be going over later. I think I have beat this topic to death. Let's move on to the AND logic function.